In this video we will explore the American War of Independence. If you enjoy these videos, please let me know about any events throughout history you would like to see. Now sit back, relax and enjoy.
His name was Eli Marsh.
He was 22 years old in the autumn of 1774, and he had never in his life traveled more than 30 miles from the farm where he was born. The farm sat at the edge of a small township in western Massachusetts, close enough to the tree line that in the evenings the shadows of the pines crept slowly across the front porch like dark, quiet water rising.
His father had built the house with his own hands before Eli could walk.
Every beam and board of it had the weight of those hands in it still. You could feel it when you pressed your palm flat against the doorframe, something solid and deliberate, something that said, "I made this, and it will last."
The land was not rich land. It never had been.
The soil was stony and cold for too many months of the year, and the winters had a way of arriving early and leaving reluctantly, like a difficult guest. But the Marsh family had learned the rhythms of that land over 2 generations, and there was a kind of quiet dignity in that knowledge, in knowing exactly when to plant, exactly which fields to rest, exactly how to read the particular shade of gray in a November sky that meant snow before morning.
Eli was the eldest of 4 children.
After him came his sister, Ruth, who was 19 and had their mother's eyes and their father's stubbornness in equal measure. Then the twins, Samuel and James, who were 12 and still believed that every fence was built primarily for the purpose of climbing. Their mother, Clara, moved through the house with a kind of worn and steady grace, the way a river moves through familiar ground, unhurried, purposeful, carving its path a little deeper with every passing year.
It was a quiet life.
Or it had been.
On the evening that this story truly begins, Eli was in the barn.
The last light of October was falling through the gaps in the old boards in long amber blades, and the air smelled of hay and horse and the faint sweetness of rotting apples from the barrel in the corner. He was mending a harness, a slow and meditative work, the kind that lets your hands move while your mind goes somewhere else entirely. The leather was cold and stiff, and he worked it with his thumbs in slow circles to soften it, the way his father had shown him. He could hear, faintly, the sound of voices from the house. His father and a neighbor, Thomas Hale, who had ridden over from the next farm just as the sun was going down. Hale was a serious man, a deacon's son, with a face that seemed to have been assembled from straight lines and right angles. He did not visit for idle reasons.
Eli set down the harness and listened. He could not make out every word. He was not meant to.
But he had heard enough words like these in recent months to understand the shape of the conversation, the particular cadence of men speaking about things that frightened them.
Boston. Parliament. Taxation.
Rights. The words moved through the cold air like stones dropped into water, each one sending ripples outward.
He picked up the harness again.
Outside, the first stars were beginning to appear. The trouble had been building for years, longer than Eli had properly understood while it was happening, the way you rarely understand a river is rising until the water is at your door. He had grown up hearing the grievances the way children grow up hearing weather as background, as the permanent condition of the world rather than as anything that might change or demand a response.
But it was changing now. He knew about the taxes. Everyone knew about the taxes.
The Stamp Act, the townshend duties, the tax on tea, that particular insult that had led, just the previous winter, to the dramatic business in Boston Harbor, where men dressed as Mohawks had tipped crate after crate of East India Company tea into the cold black water, and the whole colony had held its breath waiting to see what England would do in response. England's response had not been gentle. The coercive acts, the colonists called them, though the British Parliament had another name for them, a more administrative name, the kind of name that bureaucracies use when they wish to disguise the shape of a thing. The port of Boston had been closed. Town meetings had been restricted. The quartering of British soldiers in private homes had been Reuterized. And over all of it, like a sky pressing lower and lower, was the sense that something was ending. That the long, uneasy arrangement between the mother country and her distant children was approaching some kind of breaking point. Eli had heard men argue about this for months. In the tavern, after church, at the mill. Some said it would pass, that cooler heads on both sides of the Atlantic would find a way to step back from the edge, as they had done before. Others said it was already too late for that. That too much had been said and done, and that pride, on both sides, had now become the largest obstacle to peace. His father said very little, in public. But at home, in the evenings, when the children were supposed to be asleep, Eli had heard him. "A man has a right to the work of his own hands," his father had said once, his voice low and deliberate, speaking to Clara in the way he spoke when he was working something out. "A man has a right to the harvest of his own land. If someone else decides how much of that harvest he must surrender, and he has no say in the deciding what is he, then?"
Clara had not answered.
Or if she had, Eli had not heard it. He finished the harness as the last of the light left the barn. He sat for a moment in the near dark, the leather across his knees, listening to the horse breathing in the next stall, that slow, warm, patient sound. There was something deeply settling about being near a large animal at rest, something that reminded you of your own smallness, and made that smallness feel like a comfort rather than a weight.
He thought about the harvest they had just brought in.
Smaller than last year, but enough. Enough for winter, enough to sell a portion of the rye at the Milltown market, enough to see them through to spring if they were careful, which they always were. He thought about the field he meant to clear in the spring, on the eastern side of the property, where the soil was deeper.
He had been meaning to clear it for 2 years.
He thought about how satisfying it would be to finally do it, to pull the stumps, to break the ground, to plant something in a place that had never been planted before. He thought about Ruth, who had been quieter than usual lately, and whom he suspected was in some state of feeling regarding the blacksmith's son from the village, a young man named Peter Cole, who was tall and had kind eyes and seemed, on the available evidence, to be a decent person. He thought about the twins, who had broken a fence last week and tried to blame it on the wind. He thought about all the small, ordinary furniture of his life, the way you think about such things when you sense, not yet knowing it clearly, not yet able to name it, that the ordinary is about to become precious, that the days of simple work and simple worry may be fewer than you once assumed.
He hung the harness on its hook. He walked out of the barn and into the night.
The air was cold and clear, the way October air in Massachusetts is cold and clear, with a cleanness to it that felt almost painful in the lungs, like something very pure. The stars were fully out now, a great untroubled scatter of them, indifferent to everything that moved beneath them. Somewhere in the dark tree line, an owl spoke once and fell silent. The light from the farmhouse windows was warm and yellow against the dark. He stood there for a moment, just a moment, between the barn and the house, between the dark and the light, between the world as it had been and whatever world was coming.
Then he walked inside.
Winter came to western Massachusetts the way it always did, without apology. By the first week of November, the ground had hardened to something that rang like iron underfoot, and the sky had taken on that particular flat white quality that meant the cold had settled in for good and would not be reasoned with until March. The trees along the property line stood bare and still, their branches finely drawn against the pale sky like the careful work of someone with a very fine pen and a great deal of patience. Eli had always liked winter, in the way that people who work hard outdoors like the seasons that give them permission to slow down. The heavy labors of the farm, the plowing, the planting, the haying, the harvest were done now, and what remained was a different kind of work.
The mending of things.
The maintenance of things. The patient, indoor occupation of long evenings, harnesses and tools, and the careful accounts his father kept in a small leather ledger by the light of a single candle, his handwriting so small and neat it looked like a row of sleeping insects.
It should have been a peaceful winter.
But the letters were arriving. They came through the township's committee of correspondence, one of dozens, perhaps hundreds, of such committees that had sprung up across the colonies over the past few years, an informal network of communication that allowed towns and villages separated by days of travel to share news, share grievances, share the gradual assembling of a common understanding. The idea had been Samuel Adams's, or was credited to him, though Eli suspected that ideas of that kind are rarely the property of one mind, that they rise, rather, from the accumulated pressure of many minds pressing against the same problem until it finally gives way. The letters were read aloud at the township meeting house, a low-ceilinged room that smelled of damp wood and tallow candles and the collective breath of perhaps 40 men sitting close together against the cold. Eli attended with his father, who said little at these meetings but listened with an attention so complete it seemed almost physical, like a man leaning into a strong wind. The news from Boston was not good.
The port remained closed.
British troops, redcoats, the men called them, the word carrying a weight of contempt that had been accumulating for years, were quartered throughout the city, their presence a constant reminder of Parliament's determination to make an example of Massachusetts.
Food prices had risen. Merchants were struggling.
And among the people of that occupied city, something that had begun as frustration and indignation was hardening, slowly and surely, into something else.
Something colder. Something that would not easily be warmed again. There was a man at these meetings named Caleb Fitch. He was perhaps 50, with a grey beard and the kind of face that had spent so many decades outdoors that the weather had become part of it, the lines, the colour, the set of the jaw that suggested a permanent squinting into wind. He had fought in the French and Indian War, 20 years past, and he spoke about that experience rarely and without any of the pride or nostalgia that men sometimes carry around their soldiering like a decoration. When Caleb Fitch spoke about war, he spoke about it the way a man speaks about a river he nearly drowned in, with respect, and with a very clear memory of the cold. It was Fitch who, at the November meeting, said the thing that Eli could not stop thinking about for days afterward. The discussion had turned, as it always did, to the question of what might actually be done. There was talk of another boycott of British goods. There was talk of petitions to the Crown.
There was talk of the Continental Congress, which had met in Philadelphia that autumn and produced a Declaration of Rights that some men found stirring and others found insufficiently bold. And then Fitch had stood up, slowly, the way old men stand, not with difficulty, exactly, but with a kind of deliberateness, as though the body requires a moment to remember what it is being asked to do. "I have seen what happens," he said, "when men decide to settle a thing with powder and shot. I have held friends while they died on ground that neither of us had ever seen before and neither of us had any quarrel with.
I do not tell you this to frighten you.
I tell you because I think some of the younger men in this room have a picture in their heads of what war looks like, and I want them to know that the picture is wrong."
He paused. The room was very quiet.
"That said," he continued, "I have also seen what happens when free men surrender their rights because they are afraid of the cost of defending them. And I will tell you honestly, I do not know which of those two things frightens me more."
He sat down. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then the meeting went on.
Eli thought about those words on the walk home, his breath clouding in the dark, his father walking beside him in silence. The road back to the farm was familiar enough that he could have walked it blind, every rut, every stone, every place where the roots of the old oak near the Miller property had pushed up through the dirt and made a small, regular obstacle that you learned to step over without thinking.
Familiar ground. Known ground. What is a man, then?
His father had said, months ago, in the house. Eli was beginning to understand the question differently now. Not as an abstract philosophical puzzle, but as something immediate and personal, something that was going to require, sooner or later, an answer that was more than words.
He did not speak of this to Ruth.
She was sharp enough that she was already watching him with a particular attention, the way you watch a pot you suspect is close to boiling, and he did not want to cause her worry before there was something specific to worry about. He did not speak of it to his mother either, though he suspected she knew the shape of his thinking without being told. Clara Marsh had always had that quality of perceptiveness so quiet you could mistake it for absence until you realized how little had ever escaped her notice. He spoke of it, a little, to the horse.
This was not as strange as it sounds.
The barn was the one place on the farm where Eli was reliably alone, and the horse a broad and patient roan mare named Patience, named by the twins when they were 7, who had then found the joke of a horse named Patience endlessly amusing for approximately 3 weeks, was a creature of such magnificent indifference to human troubles that speaking in her presence felt like speaking into a space that would hold the words without judging them. "I don't know what I ought to do," he told her, one evening in early December, while he was brushing her coat in long, slow strokes. Patience shifted her weight from one foot to the other, which was her standard response to most things. "Fitch is right that war is a terrible thing," Eli continued.
"But he's also right about the other part.
"And I keep thinking if not us, then who? If not now, then when?" Patience exhaled through her nose with a sound like a small, discreet sigh. "That's not very helpful," Eli said. But even as he said it, he felt something settle, slightly, in his chest. Not resolution, not yet, that was still months away, but the first faint outlines of it, the way a distant shape begins to separate itself from the fog before you can quite make out what it is. Christmas came and went quietly. His mother made a spiced pudding from a recipe her own mother had used, and the smell of it, warm and dark and sweet, filled the house in a way that felt almost unbearably precious, the way good smells do when there is something in the air that makes you want to hold onto everything ordinary with both hands. His father gave him a new hunting knife, with a handle of pale birchwood and a blade that caught the candlelight. Ruth gave him a pair of woolen socks she had knitted herself, and accepted his thanks with the slightly defensive manner she always adopted when she had done something kind, as though she wished to make clear that it should not be taken as a habit. The twins gave him a drawing they had made together of what appeared to be a horse, though it might also have been a very elongated dog, or a table with ambitions. He thanked them with complete sincerity and put it on the shelf above his bed. That evening, after the younger children were asleep, he sat with his parents by the fire for a long while, none of them speaking very much. The fire made its small, familiar sounds. Outside, snow had begun to fall, that soft, deliberate settling of snow that turns the world quiet, as if everything is being carefully, gently put to bed. His father reached over, at some point, and put his hand briefly on Eli's arm.
Just that. No words.
Just the weight of a hand, and what it carried.
Eli looked into the fire and did not say anything either. Some things do not need saying.
Some things are held between people in the silence, in the firelight, in the particular quality of a winter evening that feels like it might last forever and also like it is almost, already, over. Spring arrived slowly that year, as though it too was uncertain about what it was walking into. The snow retreated in stages, first from the south-facing slopes, then from the fields, then from the shadowed places beneath the trees where it had packed down to a dirty, reluctant gray and clung on longest, as if making a point. By late March the mud had come, that particular deep and adhesive Massachusetts mud that swallowed boots and wagon wheels with equal indifference, and the farm had taken on the slightly battered, expectant quality that it always had in those weeks between winter and planting, everything waiting, everything on the edge of beginning again.
Eli worked.
That was what you did, when the world made you anxious.
You worked.
He cleared the eastern field he had been meaning to clear for 2 years. The stumps came out, hard roots that had been in the ground for decades, wound through the soil in complex, resistant webs, and the work required a maul and a mattock and long hours and a quality of stubborn, repetitive effort that left his shoulders burning and his hands raw and his mind, mercifully, very quiet. He liked that quality of hard physical labor, the way it reduced the world to the immediate, the weight of the tool, the resistance of the ground, the small, measurable progress of a job being done. He planted the field in early April, on a gray morning with the smell of rain in the air, pressing the rye seeds into the dark turned earth with his thumb, one by one, in the long straight rows his father had taught him to keep. There was something in that motion, the press of the thumb, the seed disappearing into the dark, that felt like a kind of faith.
An assertion that there would be a summer, that there would be a harvest,
that the world would continue in its ordinary turning long enough to make the planting worthwhile.
He was not entirely sure he believed it, but he planted anyway.
The night of the 18th of April began like any other night. Eli had been in bed perhaps 2 hours. The deep, heavy sleep of a man who has worked hard with his body all day when he heard the horse.
Not Patience. A different horse.
A horse moving fast on the road that ran past the western edge of their property, hoofbeats coming hard out of the dark, and with them a voice, a man shouting, the words indistinct at first, smeared by distance and speed, and then, as the rider came closer, suddenly clear.
The regulars are out. The regulars are marching.
Eli was on his feet before he was fully awake. He stood in the dark of his room for one disoriented moment, heart striking hard against his ribs, and then the words assembled themselves into meaning, and the meaning assembled itself into understanding, and he was pulling on his breeches, reaching for his coat, moving.
His father was already in the hallway. They did not need to speak.
They went to the window together and looked out at the road, and they saw, in the faint light of a moon that was only just past full, the shape of a rider already moving away from them, moving fast, heading east, heading toward the next farm, and the one after that, and all the farms and villages between here and wherever the news needed to go.
The regulars are out. British troops. Moving from Boston.
Moving in force, in the night, toward what? Toward whom? His father said, quietly, Concord.
Eli looked at him.
They'll be going for the stores at Concord, his father said.
The powder.
The weapons the militia's been gathering. He said it in the flat, certain tone of a man who has been expecting a thing for so long that when it finally arrives it carries less surprise than exhaustion. By morning, the news was moving through the township like fire through dry grass. Men were gathering at the meeting house by the time Eli arrived, some still in the clothes they had slept in, some carrying muskets, all of them talking that particular quality of talking that happens when people are frightened and trying to organize the fright into something useful. The air was cold and damp, the sky a pale and undecided gray, and the mud of the road was already churned dark by the feet of men who had been arriving and departing since before the sun was up. The news that came through over the course of that morning was fragmented and contradictory in the way that news from a fast-moving situation always is, each new arrival bringing a slightly different account, each account disagreeing with the others on the details while agreeing on the essential shape of what had happened. There had been a confrontation at Lexington, on the town common. A company of militia, perhaps 70 men, perhaps fewer, had faced a column of several hundred British regulars in the grey of early morning.
Someone had fired. No one knew who.
It was possible no one would ever know for certain, or that the truth of it would be buried under so many competing accounts that it would become, over time, less a fact than a question. But the result was not in dispute. 8 colonists were dead on the Lexington Green, and the regulars had marched on to Concord. And at Concord, at a bridge over a small dark river, the militia had held. They had not run. They had stood their ground, and they had fired back, and the regulars, surprised, perhaps, by the resistance, surprised, perhaps, by their own vulnerability, had begun a retreat back toward Boston that had turned, over the course of that long terrible day, into something very close to a rout. All along the road, from every farmhouse and stone wall and stand of trees, colonial militiamen had fired on the retreating column. Men who knew every stone of that ground, every rise and hollow, every place where the road bent, and a man with a musket and good eyes could make himself very useful indeed. By the time the regulars reached the safety of Boston, nearly 300 of them had been killed or wounded. The world had changed. Eli stood at the edge of the gathering and listened to all of this arrive, piece by piece, with a feeling he could not have named precisely. It was not excitement, though there was something in it that moved fast, like excitement. It was not fear, though there was something cold in it, like fear. It was something that sat between those two things and partook of both the feeling, perhaps, of a man who has seen a door he always knew existed suddenly swing open, and who now must decide whether to walk through it.
Caleb Fitch was there.
He stood apart from the louder men, his arms crossed, his grey beard catching the pale morning light.
He was not talking.
He was listening and watching, and wearing the expression of a man who has heard this music before and knows exactly how long it plays and what it costs to dance to it. He caught Eli's eye across the gathering and held it for a moment. There was nothing performative in the look, no call to action, no challenge, no particular message. It was simply the look of one man acknowledging another in a moment of shared gravity. An acknowledgement that what was happening was real and serious, and would require things of both of them that could not yet be fully imagined.
Eli nodded. Fitch nodded back.
Then they both turned back to the news still arriving from the east.
He told his family that evening.
He had rehearsed it, in some vague way, during the walk home, had tried to find the right words, the right order, the right tone that would be honest without being needlessly frightening, clear without being cold. But when the moment came, sitting at the table with the four of them, the candle between them making the familiar shadows familiar again, all the rehearsal went somewhere and he found himself simply saying it plainly.
I think I have to go. His mother set down her spoon.
Slowly, carefully, the way you set something down when you are making sure your hands do not shake.
Ruth looked at the table.
The twins looked at him, and then at their mother, and then at him again, with the particular attention of children who understand that something is happening but are not yet sure what.
His father said nothing.
His father had known this was coming since November, at least, perhaps longer. He sat with his hands flat on the table and looked at his eldest son with an expression that contained, in some compressed and private way, everything he felt about it, the pride and the terror and the grief and the necessity, all of it held together in the careful, controlled face of a man who understood that some things cannot be argued with, and that trying to argue with them only makes the leaving harder.
I know, his father said finally. Just that. 2 words. I know. That night, Eli lay awake for a long time.
The farm was very quiet around him, the familiar creaks of the house settling in the cold, the distant sound of the creek, the slow breathing of the world outside his window. He lay on his back and looked at the ceiling and thought about the rye seeds he had pressed into the eastern field just 2 weeks ago, sitting in the dark earth now, waiting for warmth, beginning the long and patient process of becoming something.
He thought about who would harvest them.
He thought about Patience in the barn, and the harness he had mended in October, and the twins' drawing of an indeterminate animal on the shelf above his head. He thought about the men on Lexington Green in the grey of early morning, standing in a line with their muskets, watching a column of redcoats come toward them down the road. Wondering, perhaps, in those last quiet seconds before everything broke open, about their own farms and their own families and their own ceilings and whether the seeds they had planted would be tended in their absence.
He thought about the bridge at Concord. Men who had held. He closed his eyes.
Sleep, when it came slowly and without drama, the way sleep comes to people who are very tired and have made, without perhaps fully knowing it, a decision that has settled something in them, not happily, not easily, but completely. Outside, the April night was cold and clear. The stars were out. The world was waiting. The morning he left was a Thursday. He remembered that, afterward, the specific, ordinary fact of it being a Thursday, as though the day of the week were a kind of anchor, a small piece of the familiar world he could hold on to as everything else shifted. Thursdays had always meant the weekly accounts, his father at the table with his ledger, working through the numbers with the careful, unhurried attention he brought to everything. There was something almost unbearably strange about the fact that this particular Thursday would begin like that and end with Eli 3 miles down the road with a musket on his shoulder and the farm already out of sight behind him.
He was up before the sun.
Not because he had slept badly, he had slept, in the end, with the deep completeness of someone who has resolved something, but because he wanted the time. Wanted an hour in the barn before the house woke up, before the goodbyes that he already knew were going to be the hardest thing about this day. He fed Patience her morning grain and stood with his forehead against her broad, warm neck for a while, breathing slowly, feeling the heat of her and the slow movement of her breathing against him. Look after them, he told her, which was not entirely rational but felt necessary. Patience shifted her weight and kept eating.
His mother had been up before him.
He found her in the kitchen when he came in from the barn, the fire already built up, a pot of porridge already on, and a bundle on the table wrapped in cloth that he could tell, from its shape and size, contained more food than he had asked her to pack and more than he could comfortably carry.
He did not say anything about this.
He sat at the table and ate what she put in front of him, and she stood at the fire with her back to him, and neither of them spoke for a long time. When she turned around, her face was composed. Clara Marsh had the kind of composure that is not the absence of feeling but the very deliberate, very effortful management of it, like a man carrying a full pail of water across uneven ground, concentrating on keeping it level with every step. She crossed to the table and sat down across from him and looked at him directly, the way she always had when she had something important to say. "You will eat when you can," she said. "You will sleep when you can. You will not take unnecessary risks simply because other men around you are taking them. Yes, Mamma. You will write to us, when it is possible. Yes. And you will come home." She said the last thing in a tone that was not quite a question and not quite a command, something in between, something that carried in it both a mother's fierce insistence and her equally fierce knowledge that there are things she cannot insist on, things that are outside her authority, things that she must simply ask for from the universe and hope. He reached across the table and took her hand. She held it very tightly for a moment, and then let go, and stood, and went back to the fire. His father walked out with him to the road. The twins were still asleep. He had looked in on them before he came downstairs, standing in the doorway of their room for a moment, watching the two of them tangled in their shared blanket, Samuel's arm thrown across James's shoulder, both of them breathing with the profound unconscious peace of children who do not yet understand departures. He had not woken them. He had stood there for a moment and looked at them and tried to fix the image of them, the exact quality of it, the exact light and sound and smell of that room in the early morning, somewhere he could keep it. Ruth was awake. She had come down while he was eating, and she had stood in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed and her jaw set and her eyes very bright, and she had said, in a voice so carefully controlled it sounded almost ordinary, "Don't do anything stupid." "I'll try," he had said. "Try harder than that," she said. And then she had crossed the kitchen and put her arms around him, quickly, tightly, for just a moment, and then stepped back and crossed her arms again and looked at the wall, and he understood that the conversation was over. His father walked beside him in silence for the first part of the road. The sun was coming up now, low and golden through the trees, throwing long shadows across the road ahead of them. And the birds were doing what birds do in the early morning in April, that full and slightly frantic performance of sound that seems to insist on the beauty of the world whether you are in a mood to appreciate it or not. The mud of the road had dried a little overnight, and their footsteps made a sound that was satisfying in its solidness. His father was carrying the old musket, not to hand over ceremonially, not yet, just carrying it, the way you carry something while you are still thinking about what to say. When they reached the place where the farm track met the main road, his father stopped. He held out the musket. It was not a new weapon. It had been his grandfather's, originally a long flintlock, the wood of the stock darkened with decades of handling, the brass fittings worn smooth. It was not a beautiful object in the way that some weapons are made beautiful, with engraving and inlay. It was a working object, a purposeful thing, worn into usefulness by generations of practical hands. Its weight, when Eli took it, was familiar. He had held it many times, but he had never held it, before now, as something that was his. His father looked at him for a long moment. There were things in that look that Eli was not old enough yet to fully read, layers of feeling that belonged to a particular kind of love, the kind that has been built up over 22 years of ordinary days, of meals and harvests and arguments and silences, of watching a child become a person and understanding that the becoming was always going to lead, eventually, to this kind of leaving. "Your grandfather carried that at Louisbourg," his father said. "Came home with it." "I know," Eli said. His father nodded. He put his hand on Eli's shoulder, both hands, briefly, and then released him. "Go, then," he said. And then, very quietly, "God keep you, son." Eli could not speak. He nodded. He turned and walked. He did not look back. He had made a decision, sometime in the night, that he would not look back. Not because he was not tempted, he was powerfully, every step of the first mile, but because he understood, with some instinct deeper than reason, that looking back would make the going impossible. That the only way through a door like this one was straight ahead, one foot and then the other, until the farm was around a bend and the road had become the only world there was.
He was not alone on the road for long.
By the time he reached the township center, there were others, men he knew, men he recognized, men he had seen his whole life at church and market and town meetings, now carrying their own muskets and their own bundles and wearing the same expression he suspected he was wearing, which was the expression of people who have made a serious decision and are now in the process of discovering what a serious decision actually feels like when you are living inside it. Among them was Peter Cole, the blacksmith's son, the young man Ruth had been watching from a careful distance. He fell into step beside Eli without ceremony, and they walked together for a while without speaking, which felt right. Some situations have their own grammar, and in this one the correct punctuation was silence. There were perhaps 20 men from the township by the time they reached the crossroads where the road from the north came in, and at the crossroads they found more men from the north, and as they walked on through the morning the numbers grew in the way that streams grow when they find a river, each tributary adding its weight to the whole becoming something that moved with a different kind of force. Caleb Fitch was among them. He walked steadily, without apparent effort, despite his 50 years, the walk of a man whose body had never been given the luxury of going soft. He carried his own musket with the easy familiarity of long acquaintance, and he looked at the gathering column of men around him with an expression that was impossible to read entirely, something between pride and sorrow, something between resolution and a very old, very quiet grief. He fell into step beside Eli as they crested a hill and saw, spread out below them in the spring morning, the first real evidence of how large this thing was becoming. The road ahead was full of men. Not dozens, hundreds. Coming from every direction, converging on the roads that led toward Boston, toward the British Army still contained within that city, toward whatever came next. Farmers and tradesmen and merchants and laborers and young men and old men, all of them moving with the same purposeful and slightly stunned quality of people who have been swept up into history and are still in the process of understanding that that is what has happened. Eli stood at the top of the hill and looked at all of it for a long moment. "Well," said Fitch, beside him. "Well," said Eli. They walked down into it together. Nobody had told him about the waiting. He had understood, in some abstract way, that soldiering involved periods of inactivity, that battles did not simply follow one after another like beads on a string, that there were gaps between the moments of action. But he had not understood the texture of those gaps. Had not understood that waiting, when it is done in a field outside a besieged city with insufficient food and unpredictable weather and 3,000 other men in various states of uncertainty around you, has a quality entirely its own, heavier than ordinary waiting, more restless, more prone to breeding the particular kind of anxiety that has nothing specific to fasten itself to and so fastens itself to everything. The camp outside Boston was a thing that had assembled itself with remarkable speed and very little plan. Men had been arriving from across Massachusetts, from Connecticut, from New Hampshire and Rhode Island, drawn by the news from Lexington and Concord and by something harder to name, a collective momentum, a sense that the moment had arrived and that to stay home was no longer a thing a certain kind of man could do without cost to his understanding of himself. They had come with their own weapons, their own supplies, their own habits and their own ideas about how things ought to be done, and the result was less an army than an extremely motivated gathering, a kind of armed town meeting spread across several miles of Massachusetts countryside. Eli's company was commanded by a captain named Aldrich, a tanner from Concord, a square and serious man of perhaps 40 who had been elected to his position by the men he commanded, which was how such things worked in those early weeks, and who seemed to regard the responsibility with the slightly startled expression of someone who had expected to vote for someone else and found himself holding the office instead. He was not a bad commander. He was methodical and fair and had enough sense to know what he didn't know, which is a quality more valuable in a leader than it might appear. Under Aldrich's careful organization, Eli's days acquired a kind of structure. Dawn to dusk, there was always something to be done, drills that were more hopeful than accomplished, in those early weeks, long columns of men learning to march in step with the imperfect synchronization of people who had spent their lives moving at their own pace across their own land. There were picket duties, standing watch at the edges of the camp in 2-hour rotations that felt longer. There was the endless, unglamorous work of keeping a camp alive, the digging and the carrying and the maintenance of order in a space that was always threatening to slide back into chaos.
And there was the food.
Or rather, there was the intermittent, unpredictable, frequently disappointing relationship with food that would, Eli came to understand, define much of his experience of soldiering. Some days the supply wagons came and there was salt pork and hard bread and dried beans, and men ate with a straightforward gratitude of people who have been hungry. Other days the wagons did not come, and men ate what they had brought with them, which, in most cases, was running low, and the mood of the camp took on a particular edge, the edge of people who are cold and uncomfortable and now also hungry, and who are beginning to wonder, privately, whether the ideals that brought them here are sufficient compensation for all of the above.
He wrote to his family when he could.
The letters were harder to write than he had expected, not because he lacked things to say, but because the gap between what he was experiencing and what he could put into words was wider than he had anticipated. He could write about the camp, about the food, about the other men, about the view from the ridge where the pickets stood, the city of Boston visible in the distance across the water, British warships in the harbor, the geometry of occupation made visible in wood and iron and canvas from a hillside a mile away.
He could write those things. He could not easily write about the feeling. The feeling was difficult because it was not one thing.
It was not simply fear, though fear was present, a low, constant thing, more like a hum than a shout, always there beneath the surface of everything else. It was not simply resolution, though that was present too. It was a complicated mixture of the two, and of loneliness, and of the odd camaraderie that forms between men who are enduring something together, and of homesickness for the farm and his family, and of something he could only describe as aliveness, a heightened quality to the way things looked and sounded and smelled that he had never experienced before and suspected was what happened to the senses when they understood that nothing could be taken for granted. He wrote to Ruth about Peter Cole, who was in a different company but close enough that they sometimes shared a fire in the evenings. He wrote that Cole seemed well and was getting on. He did not write that Cole had, in a quiet moment 2 days previous, shown him the small folded piece of paper he carried in his breast pocket, a note in Ruth's handwriting, 6 words long, that Cole had clearly read so many times the folds were wearing through.
Eli had not asked what it said. Some things are private in a way that even war does not override.
He wrote to his father about the army forming around him, about the news of the Continental Congress appointing a commander, a Virginian named Washington, a tall man by all accounts, a former officer from the French and Indian War, a man of considerable reputation.
His father would know the name.
Most men with any attention to colonial affairs knew the name. What Washington would make of this collection of farmers and tradesmen and volunteers, Eli could not yet imagine.
But the appointment felt significant.
It felt like a thing becoming more serious, more organized, more committed to its own continuation.
He was beginning to understand that this was not going to be over quickly.
Caleb Fitch seemed, if anything, more settled in camp life than most of the younger men. He had a gift for making himself comfortable in uncomfortable circumstances, for finding the least cold spot to sleep, the least smoky position near fire, the way to angle a piece of canvas against the wind that would keep out the most rain with the least effort. He shared these skills without being asked about them, in the quiet way of someone for whom this kind of knowledge is simply practical and not in any way remarkable. One evening in late May, sitting by a fire with Eli and 3 other men from the township, Fitch said something that stayed with Eli for a long time afterward. They had been talking about Bunker Hill, the ridge above Charlestown that the militia commanders were beginning to consider fortifying, a position that would allow colonial guns to threaten the British ships in the harbor and might, some men argued, force a confrontation on ground of the colonists' choosing.
There was debate about whether this was wise.
There was always debate, in that army, about whether any particular thing was wise. The British will come at us sooner or later, Fitch said, turning a stick in the fire.
That's not in question.
The question is whether we'll still be here when they do, or whether the camp will have fallen apart first.
What do you mean? One of the other men asked.
I mean that keeping men together is harder than bringing them together, Fitch said. Every man here came of his own decision.
Which is fine. That's as it should be.
But a man who came of his own decision also leaves of his own decision, when the hunger gets long enough and the waiting gets long enough and the letter from home says the planting is behind.
He turned the stick again.
The British have professional soldiers. Men who stay because it's their occupation, their livelihood. We have men who stay because they believe in something. Belief is powerful.
But it needs feeding. It needs reminding.
It needs, every so often, to be tested so it knows it's still real.
He looked up from the fire.
Bunker Hill will test it, he said.
The night before the battle was warm.
That was the detail Eli always remembered first, afterward, when he thought about those hours, not the fear, not the preparations, not the long quiet dark of the night watch, but the warmth of the air, the almost summery quality of it, the smell of the grass on the hillside where they had worked through the night digging the redoubt, throwing up earthworks by starlight, the soil coming up dark and rich and smelling of everything ordinary and growing. They worked through the night in near silence, which was itself remarkable. 3,000 men moving and digging and carrying in the dark, quietly enough that the British sentries in the harbour heard nothing until, with the coming of the dawn, the warship Lively swung its guns toward the newly crowned hill and fired. Eli heard the shot the way you hear thunder when lightning has already struck, a huge, rolling, physical sound that seemed less to travel through the air than to simply arrive, all at once, in his chest.
He looked at Fitch.
Fitch was looking at the redoubt they had spent the night building, running a professional eye over the earthworks with the expression of a man who is calculating things he has calculated before. "Hold your position," Fitch said. Quietly, to nobody in particular. Or to everybody. The sun was coming up over the harbour. Below them, boats were beginning to move. The British came in the early afternoon. They came across the water in longboats, orderly and measured, their red coats catching the summer light in a way that was, against all reason, almost beautiful, the way certain dangerous things are beautiful, the way a storm on the horizon has a beauty that does not make you less afraid of it. Eli watched them come from behind the earthworks, his musket in his hands, his heart doing something complicated in his chest that was not quite fear and not quite courage, but something that lived in the narrow, ungovernable space between the two.
There were perhaps 1,500 of them,
perhaps more. They landed on the shore below and formed their lines with the unhurried precision of men who had done this before, in other places, on other hillsides, against other people who had made the mistake of thinking that wanting something badly enough was the same as being able to defend it. Beside Eli, Peter Cole was very still. On his other side, a young man named Josiah Weber, Cooper's apprentice from Springfield, who had attached himself to their company sometime in the second week of the siege and never quite detached, was breathing in short, shallow intervals that Eli could hear distinctly above the general noise of the camp. "Slow your breathing," Eli said to him, quietly.
Webb looked at him. "Slow it down," Eli said again. "Long and slow. It helps." He did not actually know if it helped.
He was doing it himself, and it seemed to help, or at least gave the body something to do other than simply be afraid. Webb nodded and tried it, and his breathing evened out, somewhat, and he looked fractionally less like a man about to come apart. Fitch was 10 yards to Eli's left, standing at the earthwork with his musket resting on the packed soil, watching the British lines form below with the patient attention of someone reading a document he has read before in a different language and is now finding largely as expected. The order repeated down the line in voices that were steadier than the men felt, Eli suspected, was to hold fire. Hold fire until you can see the whites of their eyes. The phrase had the quality of something already becoming legend even as it was being said, one of those formulations so clean and exact that you understand, hearing it, that it will outlast the moment that produced it. But its practical meaning was simply this: ammunition was scarce, the range was long, and a shot fired too early was a shot wasted, and they could not afford to waste shots. So they held. The British lines began to advance up the hill. Eli had, in his life, done a number of things that required the suppression of the instinct to move, holding still in a blind during a long hunt, waiting out a storm in an exposed position, the particular discipline of letting a thing come to you rather than going to it.
He had always been reasonably good at this.
His father had called it patience, which was perhaps why he had named the horse that, not because she was patient, exactly, but because patience was the quality he most admired, the one he most wanted to be around.
This was different.
This required a quality of stillness that had nothing meditative about it, a stillness born entirely of will, of the conscious suppression of every animal instinct that was screaming at him to move, to run, to put as much distance as possible between himself and the thing climbing steadily toward him up the hill.
The sun was very bright.
He could smell the grass and the turned earth of the redoubt and the sweat of the men around him. He could hear the drums below, the measured, mechanical beat of the British advance, a sound designed for exactly this purpose, to make the people hearing it feel small and alone and outmatched.
He fixed his eyes on the line below and breathed, long and slow.
It helps. When the order to fire finally came, it came like a release, like something that had been pulled tight past its natural limits suddenly allowed to move.
The line erupted in smoke and sound.
Eli fired, reloaded, fired again, working the familiar mechanics of the musket with hands that knew what to do even when the mind was struggling to keep pace with events. Load, temp, prime, fire. The smoke was immediate and thick, a grey-white curtain that reduced visibility to almost nothing and turned the hillside into a confusion of shapes and sounds, shouting, the crack of musket fire. Somewhere behind him a man calling for water, somewhere to his left a sound he did not want to identify and made an immediate decision not to think about. The British line faltered, stopped, fell back. A sound went through the colonial position that was not quite a cheer, something more raw than that, something that had relief in it as much as triumph, the sound of men who had been genuinely unsure whether they would hold and had just discovered, to their own apparent surprise, that they had. They had 30 minutes, perhaps, before the British reformed and came again. Eli used the time to reload, to check on Webb, who was shaking but functional, which was all that was required, and to look along the line for Fitch. He found him still at his position, face blackened with powder smoke, reloading with the methodical calm of a much younger or much less imaginative man, or perhaps simply a man who had decided, long ago, what kind of composure he wanted to maintain when things became difficult, and had been practicing it ever since. Their eyes met. Fitch gave a single, brief nod.
Still here. Still holding. Eli nodded back. The British came a second time. And a third. By the third assault, the powder was almost gone.
This was the brutal arithmetic of that day, not the courage, which had been present in abundance, but the powder. The colonial position held through 2 full assaults on will alone, on the discipline of men who had been told to hold their fire until the last possible moment, and had done so, twice, at extraordinary cost to their own composure. But the supply wagons had not come, as the supply wagons so often did not come. And when the British formed their lines for the third advance, the men on the hill had enough ammunition for one more volley, perhaps, and then nothing but the musket stocks and what their bodies could do. Eli fired his last round and felt the weight of the empty musket in a way he had not felt it before, not as a tool waiting to be reloaded, but as a thing that had run out of what it could offer.
The British line came through the smoke. What followed was not battle in any organized sense.
It was the desperate, disorganized business of men trying to get out of a position that had become untenable, falling back through the redoubt, through the smoke, the British among them now, bayonets and musket stocks, and the terrible compressed noise of men fighting at arm's length without space or order or anything except the most basic urgency.
Eli moved.
He moved because Fitch was moving, and he followed Fitch, because Fitch seemed to know, even in that chaos, even in the smoke and noise, which direction was back, which direction was away, which direction led to a place where a man could regroup and breathe and still be alive.
They fell back down the far side of the hill.
He did not know, until they had cleared the worst of it and found themselves on open ground with the noise receding behind them, that Caleb Fitch had been hit.
It was not obvious at first.
Fitch was walking, moving steadily, not quickly, but steadily, and his face held the same composed expression it had held all day, and it was only when Eli came alongside him and looked properly that he saw the dark stains spreading through the cloth on Fitch's left side, just below the ribs. "Fitch," he said. "Keep moving," Fitch said. "You're hit." "I am aware of that," Fitch said, in the tone of a man pointing out that he is already in possession of the information being offered. "Keep moving. There's a surgeon's position at the base of the ridge." They moved together, Eli taking Fitch's weight as the older man gradually allowed it, the two of them moving in the uncomfortable, asymmetric way of a man supporting another man down through the warm afternoon, through the smell of smoke and trampled grass, toward wherever the next position was, and the next thing after that. It was only later, much later, sitting outside the surgeon's tent in the long golden light of that June evening while Fitch was being attended to inside, that Eli allowed himself to be still for a moment, to sit on the ground with his back against the wheel of a supply wagon and let the day arrive in him all at once. His hands were shaking. He looked at them as if they belonged to someone else, the powder-blackened fingers, the torn knuckle on his right hand from something he didn't remember, the particular tremor of exhaustion and released tension that made them feel like they were not quite connected to the rest of him. The day was cooling. The sun was low and the shadows were long, and somewhere across the water the city of Boston was exactly where it had been that morning, and the British flag was still above it, and the hill that 3,000 men had defended through the longest afternoon of their lives was no longer in colonial hands. They had lost the hill. And yet something had been demonstrated on that hill that was not contained in who held it at the end. Something about what these men were made of, and what they were willing to endure, and what they were not willing to surrender even when the powder ran out. Something that would travel. Eli sensed this, in the way you sometimes sense the significance of a moment while you are still inside it, much further than the hill itself. Further than Massachusetts. Further, perhaps, than any of them could yet imagine. Fitch came out of the surgeon's tent an hour later, moving carefully, his side bound in clean cloth, his face carrying the look of a man who has been informed of something he already knew. He sat down beside Eli. They sat in silence for a while. "Well," Fitch said eventually. "Well," said Eli. The stars were coming out, one by one, in the darkening sky above them. The same stars. Always the same stars, patient and unchanging, looking down on everything with the enormous indifference of things that have been here much longer than any of this and will be here long after all of it is settled. "You held," Fitch said. It was not praise, exactly. It was more like a notation of fact, a man recording something in the ledger of his understanding of the world. "We all held," Eli said. "Yes," said Fitch. "We all held." He leaned his head back against the wagon wheel and closed his eyes. And Eli sat beside him in the cooling dark, and let the day go, piece by piece, into the quiet of the summer night, the sound of the drums, and the smoke, and the weight of the empty musket, and the feel of Fitch's weight against his shoulder as they came down the hill, and the shaking hands, and all the rest of it, all of it settling slowly into him like sediment into the bed of a river, becoming part of the ground he was made of. The war was real now. He was a soldier now. And the road ahead, long and dark and uncertain as it was the road he was on, and he would walk it. One foot, then the other, until the end. This concludes the first part of the story. Sleep well. Good night.